The world once believed that truth could only be found through suffering. In the heart of the medieval age, when kingdoms rose and fell by the will of God and the sword, there was another power quietly growing, the art of torture. Not born from chaos, but from order. Not from madness, but from belief. In those cold centuries, law and faith intertwined like the iron chains that would one day bind countless souls. The Church declared that pain could cleanse. The kings decreed that agony could reveal loyalty. And the people, they watched, whispering prayers that it would never be their turn beneath the ropes. Before the dungeon came the stage. Public punishments were a spectacle, a sermon of flesh and fear. In the bustling squares of Europe, men were whipped until their backs gleamed red under the sun. Thieves hung in cages as crows tore their eyes. It was justice made visible, a warning written in blood. But as kingdoms grew more cunning, justice grew quieter. What was once shouted in daylight slipped into the shadows. Castles built rooms that no guest would ever see. Monasteries dug chambers where even prayer could not reach. And there, in the suffocating dark, the first torture devices were born. At first, they were crude: ropes, pulleys, and stones. Tools meant to restrain became instruments to destroy. The rack began as a carpenter's frame. The wheel, once for wagons, became an altar of torment. Necessity bred invention, and humanity learned that pain could be measured, adjusted, perfected. Torture was not seen as evil. It was logic. If a man's soul could be purified by suffering, then surely his lies could too. The inquisitors wrote it down. Pain is the fire that reveals truth. Each scream was a confession waiting to be extracted, and each confession a victory for order. In royal courts, judges spoke of degrees of questioning. The first degree, persuasion. The second, compulsion. The third, torment. And finally, the fourth, the silence of death. Not all who entered the chamber left it breathing, but all, they claimed, left it pure. Imagine the air inside those rooms, thick with the scent of sweat, iron, and candle wax. The interrogator's hands steady as he tightened the rope. The accused's breath quickening as each creak of the pulley brought his limbs closer to breaking. There was no music here, only rhythm, the cadence of groans, the sigh of steel. Yet behind it all stood a philosophy that truth, like sin, had to be forced out. The same minds that painted cathedrals and wrote scripture built the devices that tore bodies apart. The contradiction was not seen as hypocrisy, but as balance. Salvation required sacrifice. As the centuries turned, these methods spread across Europe, from the dungeons of London to the inquisitorial cells of Spain. Torture became a language understood by all nations. Kings, priests, and jailers each had their dialects, but the message was the same: pain is power. Even the architecture changed to serve it. Castle basements were fitted with drains to carry away the blood. Iron hooks hung like ornaments from ceilings. Walls muffled sound so that confessions could echo only in the ears of God and man. Every design had a purpose. Every shadow hid intent. But there were those who began to question.
A few chroniclers, silent witnesses to horror, wrote secretly in the margins of history. They described faces that no longer looked human after the rack, the way bodies twisted like broken wood. They wondered, could truth born of terror ever be trusted? Could a scream be proof of guilt? Still, the machines grew more elaborate. Craftsmen became specialists. The blacksmith who once made swords now forged clamps and screws. Pain had become an industry. And in a twisted irony, the more civilized Europe became, the more refined its cruelty. The church continued to bless the instruments, the monarchs continued to fund them, and the people, caught between faith and fear, continued to believe that this was justice, divine, righteous, necessary. Yet beneath it all was something darker, fascination. For even as humanity recoiled from pain, it could not look away. Crowds gathered to hear the rumors of the rack, to whisper about the wheel. Pain was horror, but it was also theater. And like all performances, it demanded an audience. In time, the line between punishment and entertainment blurred. The dungeon became a mirror of the world above it, ordered, ritualistic, hungry for control. And thus, the birth of pain was not just the invention of devices, but the awakening of a philosophy, that suffering could be harnessed, that fear could rule more effectively than mercy. As the candlelight flickered on those cold stone walls, one truth remained unspoken: that once mankind learned to create instruments for agony, it would never stop finding ways to use them. This was the beginning, not of justice, but of its imitation. The dawn of an age where the measure of truth was not words, but screams.
They called it the sede del tormento, the chair of torment. To sit upon it was not to rest, but to surrender, a throne forged not for kings, but for the condemned. Imagine the sight, a massive iron seat blackened by years of fire and blood. Its back and armrests bristled with hundreds of sharpened spikes, each meticulously placed to pierce but not to kill. The surface, cold at first, would soon glow red when heated from below by burning coals. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, precise, patient, deliberate. The prisoner was stripped bare, trembling in the damp air of the chamber. The interrogator's words were soft, almost kind. "Confess, and you will be spared the pain." But everyone knew the promise was hollow. The truth was already written. The chair merely served to make it official. When the condemned refused to speak, they were lowered onto the iron seat. The sound of flesh meeting metal was like a whisper of death. Spikes sank into skin, blood welled up from 1,000 points. The body stiffened, but the hands were bound, wrists, ankles, chest, forcing stillness where instinct screamed for escape. Heat rose slowly from below. The iron creaked as it expanded, glowing faintly in the torchlight. The pain was not sharp. It was spreading, crawling, alive. It filled the lungs, the bones, the mind. Every movement drove the spikes deeper until the prisoner became part of the chair itself, a living sculpture of agony. The interrogator watched. Sometimes he would pause, let the silence linger, then whisper again, "The truth, only the truth." And in that insupportable moment, truth lost all meaning. To survive became the only confession left.
Records from inquisitorial archives describe these scenes without emotion. The subject resisted for 3 hours and then admitted to consorting with the devil. Another notes simply, the body expired before the statement could be signed. To the officials, this was order. To the church, purification. But to the blacksmith who built the chair, it was craftsmanship. He knew the measure of fear in every curve of iron. He knew the weight of pain his creation could bear before it broke a man's will.
The iron chair was used across Europe, from Nuremberg to Paris, from Florence to Madrid. In each region, it carried a different name, a different ritual, but the same purpose, to turn the human body into its own betrayer. In some versions, the seat had a grill beneath so that the heat could be adjusted, slow enough to blister, fast enough to char. Others had spikes coated with resin to make the wounds fester. Every variation spoke of creativity without mercy. The condemned often confessed to anything. They spoke of demons, of pacts with spirits, of crimes that never happened. They named their neighbors, their lovers, even their children. And when the pain grew too much, they whispered prayers that were drowned out by their own screams. Afterward, the chair would cool in the darkness. The smell of burnt flesh lingered for days. Guards would wash the floor, but the stains never truly disappeared. The next morning, another prisoner would be brought in, and the ritual would begin again. The iron chair was not merely a device, it was philosophy made metal. It embodied the belief that truth could be extracted through suffering, that justice could be proven by endurance. It was the physical form of an idea that still haunts us, that pain purifies. And yet there is something hauntingly human about the iron chair. It was not built by monsters, but by men, by those who prayed before their work, who dined with their families after the executions, who truly believed they were serving righteousness. The most terrifying truth of all is not the cruelty of the machine, but the normality of those who used it. In every age, the iron chair finds a new shape. Sometimes it is forged in iron. Sometimes it hides behind words, systems, and silence. But its purpose remains the same: to force submission, to make the human spirit bow before authority. The iron chair of the medieval world is long gone, rusted and silent in museums. Yet when you look at it, those spikes, that cold emptiness, you can almost hear the echo of a breath once drawn between screams. A breath that asked in the last flicker of consciousness, "Is this the truth you wanted?" There was a sound that haunted the stone halls of medieval prisons, a slow, creaking moan, like the breath of the dungeon itself. It was not the voice of the condemned, not yet. It was the voice of the rack awakening. At first glance, the rack looked almost simple. A long wooden frame, roughly the length of a man, fitted with rollers at each end. Thick ropes ran from the rollers to the wrists and ankles of the prisoner. A crank handle stood at one end, a small, almost insignificant thing, until it began to turn. Every turn of that handle meant inches stolen from the body. Sinews stretched, bones shifted, tendons screamed. What began as pressure soon became tearing. And through that tearing came the slow unmaking of what it meant to be human. The rack was not built to kill. Death was too merciful, too final. It was a machine of transformation,
designed to reshape the body until the mind broke first. To the interrogators, it was the perfect device. The body did their work for them. In England, it was called the Duke of Exeter's Daughter, a cold jest, in honor of the nobleman who introduced it. In France, le chevalet, the little horse. In Italy, the equileo. Each name whispered across borders, carrying the same dread. Wherever it appeared, truth soon followed, or something that sounded like it. In the Tower of London, beneath damp stone and torch smoke, the rack claimed countless victims. Political prisoners, spies, traitors, men and women who knew secrets that kings demanded to hear. Among them was Guy Fawkes, caught in the infamous gunpowder plot of 1605. When he refused to betray his companions, King James I ordered him to be gently tortured and then more severely. The rack obeyed. After days of agony, Fawkes confessed. When he signed his name, the letters barely resembled handwriting, only trembling lines scratched by a shattered hand. The interrogators took this as proof of guilt. They never questioned whether truth could survive when the body was broken. What made the rack truly terrifying was not the pain itself, but the anticipation. The victim would watch the ropes tighten, feel the tension rise. The first turns were merciful, even deceptive, just enough to pull the muscles taut. Then came the click, the wooden groan, the pull that felt eternal. There was no blood at first, no visible wound, only the body's silent rebellion, joints popping, shoulders dislocating one by one. The skin stretched thin over muscle like parchment ready to tear.
The torturer would pause, waiting for a word, a name, a plea. When none came, he turned the handle again, slowly, always slowly. Some accounts tell of victims growing taller by several inches before they died. Others describe how the bones separated completely from their sockets, leaving the arms hanging loose like ropes. The pain was indescribable, yet in those chambers it was method, an instrument of persuasion written into law. For the Church, the rack was divine assistance. It revealed heretics who lied under God's gaze. For monarchs, it was power made visible, a warning that loyalty could be stretched but never broken without consequence. Yet not all torturers were sadists. Some believed, sincerely, that they were instruments of truth. They spoke calmly as they turned the wheels, offering prayers for the souls they destroyed. It was a profession of faith twisted into cruelty. When the confession came, and it always did, the room filled with a strange quiet. The torturer stopped. The ropes slackened. The prisoner sagged, trembling and sobbing. The words they spoke were written down, stamped with official seals, sent to the throne or the altar as justice. No one asked if those words were real. Afterward, the prisoner was often left to rot in a cell, arms dangling unnaturally, body permanently bent. Some survived for years, crippled and silent, their names erased, but their screams immortalized in the memory of the stones. To this day, no instrument captures the spirit of medieval torture quite like the rack. It was elegant in its simplicity, monstrous in its purpose. A wooden frame, a few ropes, and the human body. That was all that needed to destroy kingdoms of will. And though centuries have passed, the metaphor of the rack remains. The slow turning of pressure, the stretching of limits until something gives way. In politics, in power, in belief, humanity still builds its own racks, only now they are unseen. The rack was never truly dismantled. It merely changed form. The creak of its wheels may have faded, but the lesson endures. There is no truth that can be born from agony. Only surrender dressed as confession. And in that surrender lies the darkest secret of the medieval age, that in their hunger for order, men discovered not truth, but the boundless reach of their own cruelty.
In the center of a silent square stood a wooden wheel, taller than a man, heavy as fate itself. To the unknowing, it looked like something pulled from a cart, simple, ordinary, harmless. But to those who had seen its purpose, it was a vision of the end, the breaking wheel, the Catherine wheel, the Rad der Hölle, the wheel of hell. This was not justice delivered in secret dungeons. This was justice displayed under the open sky. The crowd gathered long before dawn, wrapped in cloaks against the chill, children perched on shoulders, priests muttering prayers. They came not to mourn, but to watch, to see the law in motion. The condemned was brought forth, bound, trembling, or sometimes already resigned to what would come. His crimes were read aloud: murder, treason, heresy, theft. The words were almost irrelevant. Once the sentence was pronounced to be broken upon the wheel, the outcome was already written in his body. The executioner was not a brute, but an artist. His tools were simple: an iron bar, a wooden wheel, and the crowd's expectation. The ritual began with precision. The condemned was stretched out, limbs spread across the wheel's spokes or laid beneath it. The executioner raised the iron bar and with one clean strike shattered the bone, then another, then another. The rhythm was almost methodical: forearm, shin, thigh, a pattern of destruction. The screams rose and fell, mingling with the murmurs of the onlookers. Mothers covered their children's eyes, yet peeked through their fingers. For some, the act was holy, a reminder that sin brought pain. For others, it was theater. Each strike turned the human form into something unrecognizable. Flesh bulged, bones jutted through skin. The executioner moved with calm, deliberate grace, turning agony into ceremony. When the breaking was complete, the shattered body was woven into the spokes, arms twisted around wood, legs bound backward. Then came the wheel's cruelest gesture: rotation. Lifted upon a pole, the wheels spun slowly in the air, the condemned still alive, bones crushed but heart beating. The crowd gazed upward, watching as the man turned beneath the sun, a living effigy of guilt, a warning that revolved above them all. Death came slowly, sometimes over hours, sometimes days. The executioner might grant mercy by striking the chest or neck to end it, but mercy was not always given. Some rulers ordered that the condemned remain visible until the ravens came, their cries echoing long after the crowd dispersed. History tells of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, whose attempted execution by the wheel miraculously failed when it shattered before her touch. The legend gave birth to her symbol, the Catherine wheel, a saintly emblem that once meant faith, now stained by memory of pain. The wheel served more than vengeance. It was spectacle made sacred. In the eyes of the church and the crown, it was purification by suffering, a display of divine balance. Sin was chaos, the wheel restored order. Each rotation a sermon, each crack of bone a warning. The ritual extended beyond the physical. The condemned's final words were transcribed, often forced, then displayed alongside his body. "Let all who see remember," the magistrates declared, "that the wages of sin are suffering." And yet, among the executioners themselves, there was an unspoken understanding, a knowledge of the line between punishment and madness. Some whispered prayers as they worked, asking forgiveness for their craft. Others grew numb, their hands steady even as the crowd cheered. The wheel became a symbol of the era's contradictions, faith and cruelty, law and spectacle, salvation and blood. It was the circle of human belief turning endlessly upon itself. When the wind blew across the square long after the execution, it carried the faintest sound, the creak of wood, the whisper of a life once bound. For the people it was over, for the condemned it was eternal. Centuries later, the wheel would vanish from public squares, replaced by the guillotine, the noose, the bullet. Quicker methods, cleaner deaths. But the essence of the wheel, the desire to make punishment visible, to make pain a message, never truly disappeared. Even now when we speak of breaking someone, the echo of that medieval device lingers in our words. We have refined our cruelty, hidden it behind walls, laws, and silence. Yet the wheel still turns, unseen but eternal, grinding in the machinery of power, in the justifications of righteousness, in the quiet turning of history itself. The breaking wheel did more than end lives. It revealed something fundamental about humanity, that we could look upon agony and see order, that we could name suffering justice and believe it, and perhaps most hauntingly, that when the wheel finally stopped turning, no one ever asked if the world it left behind was truly any less broken.
The door closes behind you with a sound that feels eternal. The torchlight flickers, revealing the chamber's walls, stone darkened by smoke, slick with damp. Somewhere in the corner, a chain clinks. A voice murmurs a prayer. And then, silence. This is not the dungeon of a king or a warlord. This is the house of God, or so they claimed. The Spanish Inquisition was born not from chaos, but from faith. Its purpose was simple: to protect the purity of belief, to find heresy where it hid. But in its pursuit of souls, it learned to master the body. It was not the sword that made the Inquisition feared across continents. It was the devices built in the name of salvation. The first of these was the strappado, a rope, a pulley, and gravity. That was all it needed. The victim's wrists were bound tightly behind the back, then attached to a rope that ran through a ring fixed high above. With a simple pull, the prisoner was lifted into the air, shoulders twisting, joints dislocating under their own weight. Sometimes the inquisitor would drop them suddenly, only to halt the fall mid-air, a brutal dance between breaking and survival. No blood was spilled, no wounds to show, yet bones cracked quietly beneath skin, and agony filled the void. The inquisitors called it the question, for it was meant not to punish, but to persuade. Another method was the water cure. The accused was tied down, their mouth forced open with iron prongs. Then pitchers of water were poured relentlessly, one after another, until the stomach swelled, lungs gasped, and the victim choked on life itself. The interrogators watched for the moment when the line between drowning and confession blurred. This was not madness.
It was doctrine. Every act was written, measured, justified. Pain purifies the spirit, one priest wrote. In agony, the falsehood is burned away. The garrote came next, a device of final mercy, or so it was said. A metal collar fitted with a screw. When turned, it crushed the neck slowly, deliberately. It was used for executions, the last step for those who refused to repent even after the strappado and the flames. Death was slow, but quiet, an ending approved by both faith and law. To the Church, torture was a tool of confession, not punishment. But in practice, it became both. The accused were often guilty of nothing more than whispering the wrong word, reading a forbidden book, or being born to the wrong bloodline. Jews, Muslims, converts, philosophers, all fell into its net.
The inquisitors themselves believed they were saving souls. They prayed before beginning their work. They recorded every confession with precision. To them, pain was a divine language, one that only the faithful could interpret. Inside the chamber, the line between sinner and savior vanished. The torturer asked, "Do you renounce the devil?" The accused cried out, "Yes, yes!" The penitent's voice broke, yet the interrogation continued, for a confession made in fear was never enough. It had to be repeated, rewritten, witnessed. Truth, they believed, was not spoken, it was extracted. Sometimes, when the cries echoed too long, the priests would step outside and whisper prayers. They said it was to cleanse the soul before the next question. But in the silence that followed, the screams became part of the ritual, the chorus of purification. And then there was the rack of conversion, a device said to be used not for enemies of the Church, but for its children who had strayed. It resembled the executioner's rack, but with crosses carved into the wood. Each turn of the wheel stretched the body toward heaven, or so they claimed. When the Inquisition's records were discovered centuries later, the testimonies read like confessions of madness. Quote, "He did not confess until after the second question," unquote. Another simply ends with the words, "He was delivered to the mercy of fire." The fire. The ultimate purifier. The stake became the final stage of every interrogation that failed to find peace. Bound in chains, surrounded by kindling, the condemned were offered one last chance to repent. Some did. Some cursed. Some prayed as the flames climbed their bodies, believing their pain would reach heaven before their souls did. And the people watched. They always watched. The executions were public, a theater of faith. The Church called them autos de fe, acts of faith. Priests sang hymns, banners fluttered, and incense mingled with the stench of burning flesh. Salvation, they said, was beautiful. Yet behind every holy word lay a simple truth. The Inquisition's devices were not instruments of God. They were mirrors, reflecting humanity's deepest fear of doubt. The strappado, the garrote, the water cure, each one born not from hatred, but from certainty. The certainty that pain could make belief pure, that fear could make faith strong. And so, in the dim glow of the torches, beneath the painted eyes of saints, the Inquisition became what it feared most, the embodiment of sin itself. Centuries later, the Church would renounce these acts, calling them errors of zeal, excesses of faith. But the echoes remain, carried through history like whispers in stone corridors.
For the tools have changed, but the idea endures. that to control the soul, one must first break the body. The Spanish Inquisition ended long ago, its devices rusting in museums and forgotten vaults. Yet their legacy lingers in the human mind, a reminder that the greatest cruelties are often committed not in hatred, but in the unshakable belief that one is right. And in that belief, the flames never truly went out. It was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, a cruel deception, for within its polished metal petals lay one of the most disturbing inventions of the medieval world. They called it the pear of anguish, and to see it was to question what the word justice had ever meant. The device resembled a fruit carved from iron, 4 curved leaves joined at the base, a screw mechanism at the top. When turned, the petals slowly opened, expanding outward like a flower blooming in reverse. But where beauty opens to the sun, this flower opened only to darkness. Its purpose was not to kill swiftly, it was to humiliate, to destroy, to desecrate. The pear was reserved for the unholy, women accused of witchcraft, of adultery, of speaking against the church. Sometimes it was used on men labeled heretics or traitors. The torturer chose the orifice, the mouth, the rectum, or the most terrible of all, the womb. The device was inserted closed. Then the screw began to turn. A slow grinding sound like iron teeth on bone. The petals opened, tearing flesh as they spread, crushing soft tissue, rupturing organs. No amount of screaming could stop the hand that turned the screw. It was a ritual of power, a punishment for those whose words or bodies had defied control. Few written records remain. Most were destroyed or hidden behind the church's silence. Yet whispers survived in inquisitorial testimony, merchant letters, and the dark folklore of Europe. Some said the pear was invented in France during the 16th century, crafted by a blacksmith under royal commission. Others claimed it first appeared in Italy, used by city guards to discipline prostitutes who defied curfew. The truth is uncertain, but the fear it inspired was universal. In the minds of its makers, the pear was symbolic. The mouth that blasphemed, the body that sinned, both could be silenced, cleansed, and reshaped through pain. To those who wielded it, the device was divine correction made mechanical. To those who suffered, it was an unending violation of soul and flesh.
Imagine the chamber where it was used, the torchlight flickering across stone, the inquisitor reading a charge. You have spoken against holy doctrine. Or perhaps, you have tempted men with your body. The victim trembling, pleading, offering names, prayers, anything. And yet the hand still turned the screw, because repentance in that world was never enough without pain. When it was used in the mouth, the pear shattered teeth, tore the tongue, and dislocated the jaw. Words became blood. For those accused of lying, it was the final irony. Truth was demanded, but the very instrument destroyed the ability to speak. When used on women, it became an act of religious cruelty disguised as moral correction. The church wrote of cleansing, impurity. The men who watched saw something else: control, domination, the silencing of voices that dared to resist. Many historians today debate whether the pear was ever widely used, or if it was a later invention of myth, a relic of fear exaggerated by the centuries. But the absence of evidence does not erase the reality it represents. For even if the device itself was rare, the idea behind it, the need to control through humiliation, was everywhere. It was present in the witch hunts, in the public shaming of women in stocks, in the branding of heretics, in the silence forced upon victims who could not speak their truth.
The pear was not merely metal, it was philosophy made flesh. Pain as purification, control disguised as virtue. And so the legend spread. Traveling merchants carried tales of it from city to city, whispers in taverns, warnings in dark alleys. In Paris, it was said that noblewomen kept replicas as curiosities, proof of the church's power. In Prague, collectors displayed them beside racks and thumbscrews, as if cruelty were a thing to be admired. Centuries later, when the Age of Enlightenment dawned and reason began to challenge faith, the pear re-emerged as a symbol of mankind's most intimate barbarity. It was no longer a tool of law, but of fascination, exhibited in museums, described in books, recreated in plays. The world that once hid its sins now showcased them behind glass. But even as we stare at these relics, we rarely ask the most important question: what kind of mind conceives of such a thing? A craftsman, perhaps, paid well for his skill? A priest who believed suffering could save souls? Or a magistrate who saw the body as nothing more than property to correct? Each one believed they were maintaining order. None of them saw themselves as monsters. And that is the true horror of the pear of anguish. Not its spikes or its mechanics, but its purpose. It was never meant to kill. It was meant to remind, to warn, to silence. It whispered to all who saw it that rebellion was not only punished, but desecrated, that to speak against power was to invite a violation worse than death. When you see it now, resting quietly in a museum display, its metal polished and harmless, it is easy to forget the screams it once drew from the living. But if you look closer, past the gleam of the glass, you can almost hear the echo, not just of pain, but of centuries of fear disguised as faith.
The pear of anguish is more than a torture device. It is a mirror, showing us that beneath the armor of righteousness, beneath the robes of justice, mankind has always found ways to turn shame into punishment and belief into cruelty. And like all mirrors of history, it does not accuse the past alone. It asks us still, in the quiet of our modern comfort, how far would we go to silence what we fear to hear? They led him down the corridor barefoot, the sound of each step echoing like a prayer swallowed by stone. Torches hissed on the damp walls, throwing trembling light across iron hooks, chains, and shadows that looked like specters of those who had been here before. At the end of the hall stood a strange, towering structure, wooden, sharp, and silent. It looked almost like a stool raised on a frame, a cone rising from its center. But this was no seat for mortals. It was called the Judas Cradle, the most humiliating throne ever built by human hands. Its shape was deceptively simple, a pyramid of polished wood, the tip smooth but unforgiving. The victim was stripped, hoisted by ropes, and suspended above the point. The interrogator adjusted the height carefully. Precision mattered here. Then, with slow and deliberate control, the prisoner was lowered until the tip met flesh. Gravity did the rest. The body's own weight became the instrument of torture. Muscles strained, the spine quivered, the ropes creaked softly with every breath. The tip pierced skin, inch by inch, spreading and tearing as the victim's body sagged. No blade, no fire, only the cruel patience of pressure. They said it was a test of purity, a punishment for heretics, rebels, and those accused of unnatural acts. Men and women alike met the cradle's point, though for women it carried an additional layer of shame, a symbolic desecration of body and faith alike. The inquisitors called it La Culla di Giuda, the Judas Cradle, the traitor's cradle, the sinner's rest. Its name carried a theology of betrayal, of Judas Iscariot, who had sold the Son of God with a kiss. To the torturers, every confession extracted upon it was another act of divine justice. To the condemned, it was the cruelest intimacy with death imaginable. The device was designed with thought, too much thought. The pyramid's tip was oiled to prevent infection, ensuring that the victim would not die quickly. A ring system beneath allowed the torturer to control descent, slow enough to prolong agony, fast enough to keep the prisoner conscious. Sometimes weights were added to the legs to hasten the inevitable. Other times, the process lasted for days.
And all the while, the victim's body trembled upon that single point, suspended between earth and heaven, torn by both gravity and guilt. Witnesses wrote that the chamber would fill with the stench of blood and fear so thick it clung to the air. One chronicler described a man who survived the cradle for 3 days, his voice gone, eyes wide and unseeing, his body shaking even after release. When he was asked what he had confessed, he could not remember. His mind had been emptied, his soul stretched thin by terror. The Judas Cradle was not only about pain, it was about humiliation. The body was made to betray itself, to bear its own weight, to become its own executioner. There was a grim poetry in its design. The condemned flesh was the very force that destroyed them. The torturer simply watched, patient as a priest performing a dark mass. In some regions, the cradle was modified, spikes added, seats greased with oils, the pyramid made of metal instead of wood. The purpose remained unchanged, to extract truth, to enforce obedience, to remind all who saw it what power could do when clothed in righteousness. There are whispers that it was used in Italy during the Inquisition, in France under secret tribunals, even in the courts of Spain. Yet, like so many medieval horrors, its exact origins are clouded by secrecy and shame. Some historians claim the Judas Cradle was later exaggerated, its existence more legend than record. But even if myth, it reveals a truth far deeper: the human fascination with the ritual of suffering. The cradle was more than an instrument. It was a statement. It said, "You will yield not just your words, but your dignity. You will betray yourself as Judas betrayed his master." To those who watched, it was a sermon. To those who suffered, it was eternity. In the dim light of the dungeon, the inquisitor would often whisper verses as the ropes creaked. "Confess, and you shall be lifted from pain." But every confession was met with another turn of the winch, another descent toward the tip. Truth, it seemed, was not the goal. Surrender was. The Judas Cradle's name was not chosen by chance. Judas did not die by the sword or flame. He died by his own hand, undone by the weight of his sin. And so this device mirrored that fate. The condemned destroyed by their own body, their own burden, their own humanity. When the cradle was finally removed from use, its wood burned or its frame buried, the memory endured in whispers. Pain this intimate does not vanish. It embeds itself into the human story. Today, replicas of the Judas Cradle sit in dark museums, surrounded by tourists who stare with morbid curiosity.
They lean close, examining the craftsmanship, murmuring disbelief. Some even laugh nervously, calling it barbaric, ancient. But few realize that the idea behind it, the breaking of the will through humiliation, still exists in quieter, invisible forms. The Judas Cradle is not just a relic of the past. It is a mirror of every system that seeks confession over truth, obedience over freedom, silence over dignity.
In the flicker of its shadow, we see ourselves, the part of humanity that still builds new cradles, in new shapes, with new justifications. And somewhere, in the echo of every coerced confession, the old wood still creaks. The weight still bears down. The cradle still waits, patient as ever, for its next believer in the art of pain. It stands tall in the imagination, a towering sarcophagus of blackened steel, shaped like the body of a woman, her face serene and cold. Inside, a forest of metal spikes waits to embrace whoever dares step within. When the doors close, they say, the spikes pierce, but do not kill. A slow death by inches, each breath a prayer that will not be answered. They call her the Iron Maiden, the most infamous torture device in history. But here's the truth that chills deeper than any scream. She may never have existed at all. The Iron Maiden is both an object and a myth, a creation of fear, born centuries after the age of true medieval torture had passed. Yet her legend endures because she speaks to something ancient in us, our fascination with cruelty dressed in beauty. The supposed device first appeared in stories from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, long after the Middle Ages had ended. It was said to have been discovered in Nuremberg, Germany, inside an old dungeon, a tall metal coffin lined with spikes, capable of closing upon its victim like a lover's embrace. The story spread quickly through Europe, reprinted in pamphlets, displayed in traveling exhibitions. People gasped at its elegance, a machine of death shaped like a saint. They imagined it used by the Inquisition, by kings and tyrants, by those who believed that faith could be enforced by agony. The image was perfect, a relic of the Dark Ages, proof that civilization had once reveled in brutality. But the truth, as historians later found, was far stranger. There were no records of an Iron Maiden in medieval manuscripts, no mentions in Inquisition archives, no sketches in royal torture inventories. Not a single reliable witness had ever seen one in use. The earliest real object labeled as such, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was likely constructed in the late 1700s from older artifacts and the imagination of a showman. Its creation was not an act of punishment, but of performance.
In the age of enlightenment, when reason was rising and old faiths were fading, Europeans began to look back upon the Middle Ages as a time of darkness, a mirror for everything they now despised. Museums and fairs began exhibiting medieval torture devices, whether real or reconstructed, to prove how far humanity had come. The Iron Maiden was the crown jewel of this theater, the queen of pain, conjured not by priests or kings, but by storytellers. Still, the myth had power. Writers, artists, and preachers embraced her image. She appeared in engravings and novels, standing like an idol of vengeance, a silent witness to man's capacity for cruelty. Tourists paid to see her, to stand before the iron figure and imagine the last moments of a soul crushed within her embrace. Yet there were clues to the fiction even then. The spikes inside were often too short to kill, too irregularly placed to fit a human body. Some versions had mechanisms that would have made them impossible to close.
They were, in truth, props. Tools of horror storytelling before cinema was born. But that did not stop the legend from spreading. Soon, every medieval dungeon claimed to have one. Every storyteller embellished the myth. Some said the Iron Maiden whispered as she closed, her victim's blood draining through a hidden basin. Others swore she was modeled after the Virgin Mary, her face gentle, even as she devoured sinners. The irony was not lost on historians. The Iron Maiden, they said, was a punishment for the modern imagination, a creation of guilt, not faith. It revealed more about the 19th century's fascination with cruelty than the 15th century's reality. Yet, in a way, she belongs to both. For even if she never existed in steel, her spirit was born of truth. The medieval world did build devices that crushed, burned, stretched, and broke the human body in the name of order. The Iron Maiden became their symbol, a myth that gathered all their darkness into one haunting form. She was the perfect metaphor. Beauty is cruelty, faith is violence, salvation as suffocation. There's something eerily intimate about her legend. The way she holds her victim, close and quiet. The way she kills without spectacle. Unlike the wheel or the rack, the Iron Maiden's horror is private, a secret between the condemned and the steel. It is death as a whisper, not a scream. That intimacy, perhaps, is why the myth endures. Because, deep down, we recognize the truth it hides. That the worst tortures are often unseen, and that the softest touch can wound the deepest.
Even today, the Iron Maiden stands in museums, her doors open, her interior gleaming with spikes. Visitors lean close, fascinated, repulsed. Some take photos, others step back, uneasy. The guide explains that it was likely never used, a fabrication of later centuries. But the listeners rarely care. The myth is too strong. They want to believe she was real. And perhaps that is the final irony, that a device born of imagination has become more terrifying than any that truly existed. For in the end, the Iron Maiden is not about iron or spikes. It is about the human need to make monsters of our past, so we can pretend we have conquered them. But when we look into her hollow face, the cold serenity of her mask, we are not staring into history. We are staring into ourselves, into that part of the soul that still finds beauty in horror, that still invents new ways to dress cruelty as justice. She was never real, and yet she has never stopped existing. He steps into the chamber quietly, his boots clicking against the stone. No sword, no armor, just a quill, parchment, and eyes that never flinch. The man bound before him trembles, but the interrogator does not shout. He does not rage. He does not need to. This is not war. This is procedure. The medieval interrogator was not a monster in rags. He was an official, a servant of order. He operated by rules, rules crafted by courts, kings, and the church. His task was not to punish, but to extract truth. That word, truth, justified everything that followed. He begins with calmness, because terror works best when it arrives slowly. The prisoner is asked to confess. Sometimes it is over a candlelit table, sometimes beneath the shadow of the rack. The first words are soft. The interrogator speaks of mercy, forgiveness, the salvation that comes through honesty. But when words fail, he signals to the assistants. The tools are prepared, and the room changes. The sound of tightening rope, the metallic clink of chains,
the scrape of iron against stone. These are the instruments of persuasion. The interrogator watches the prisoner's breathing, the eyes darting, the muscles stiffening in anticipation. He knows the body well. He knows when it's about to break. Torture was never random. It was art in its most perverse form, precise, timed, almost scientific. The interrogator did not simply inflict pain, he conducted it like a symphony. Every turn of the screw, every pull of the cord was part of a rhythm designed to produce one thing: words. And yet he did not call it pain. He called it illumination.
In the records of the Inquisition, the process was divided into stages: persuasio, persuasion, gentle questioning; compulsio, compulsion, when the body joins the conversation; then tormentum, the final act, when silence itself becomes a crime. The interrogator was judge, priest, and executioner in one. He could end the suffering at any moment with a confession, but that mercy was a mirage. For the moment a confession was spoken, it had to be confirmed under pain again to prove it was sincere. Thus, the condemned confessed twice, once from fear, once from despair. It was said that the best interrogators never raised their voices. They didn't need to. Their authority came from ritual. The room itself did the talking. The dripping water, the groaning beams, the smell of wax and iron. Even before the first blow, most prisoners had already begun to die inside. The interrogator wrote everything down, every pause, every scream, every word that escaped the lips of the broken. These transcripts became official documents, sealed with wax, stamped with the insignia of faith or crown. To the outside world, it looked like truth, reason triumphing over deceit. But truth extracted through agony is not truth at all, it is survival. Still, the system thrived because it worked. Kings received the answers they wanted. Priests heard confessions that proved sin's existence. And the people, terrified and fascinated, believed that justice had been served. Some interrogators believed they were doing holy work. They prayed before each session, asking forgiveness for the pain they were about to cause. "God sees the heart," they would whisper, "but I must open the flesh to reach it." Others took pride in their craft, their ability to make the strongest men weep, to unravel the proud with nothing more than silence and time. One chronicler described the most skilled interrogator in Paris as a man so gentle in speech that even angels might envy his calm. Yet hundreds confessed under his hand, and few survived to see daylight again. What made the interrogator so terrifying was not his cruelty, but his conviction. He did not see himself as evil. He saw himself as necessary. His tools were not weapons, but instruments. His victims were not people, but puzzles to be solved. And his chamber was not a dungeon, but a court of divine reason. In this cold theater, pain became language. Every scream was an answer, every silence a question. The interrogator listened, deciphering fear as if it were a dialect only he could understand. Even when the torture ended, his influence did not. The victims he broke became witnesses, their forced confessions spreading through towns and courts, shaping laws and beliefs. Entire witch hunts began from a single trembling voice that had once been dragged through this chamber. And when he left for the evening, the interrogator washed his hands,
dined with his family, and prayed for the souls he had saved. He slept soundly. After all, he was only doing his duty. That is what makes his legacy so haunting. The rack, the wheel, the strappado, these devices were terrifying, but he required his command. They were his brush and chisel, but he was the artist.
Centuries later, his methods evolved. The world learned to call them by new names: interrogation, re-education, enhanced questioning. The chambers changed shape, now hidden in basements, prisons, or behind closed government doors. But the art remained: the calm tone, the threat of silence, the slow erosion of the human spirit. The medieval interrogator may have vanished into history, but his voice lingers in every question that begins with the words, "For your own good, tell us the truth." And in that moment, when fear meets authority, when the body trembles and the mind fractures, his art lives again, unseen, unending, and always justified. Beneath the marble halls and glittering chandeliers of Europe's great palaces lay another world, a world of whispers, chains, and screams that no music could drown out. Behind every crown there was a dungeon. Behind every king there was a secret chamber. And in those dark places, royal blood was spilled not in battle, but in silence. Power, after all, has never been content with the sword alone. It demands control of words, of loyalty, of breath. The medieval dungeon was more than a prison. It was a throne room for fear. Built deep beneath castles and keeps, its air was heavy with damp and deceit. Torches flickered against walls stained with centuries of confession. The floors were uneven, carved hastily into rock, as though the earth itself wanted to swallow the truth it heard there. In these royal underworlds, justice wore velvet gloves. The instruments of pain were hidden beneath tapestries, their existence denied even as their victims vanished from the banquet halls above. Kings and queens spoke of divine right, of power ordained by heaven, but when their rule was threatened, divinity became a quiet executioner. Take, for instance, the Tower of London. To the world, it was a fortress, strong, proud, eternal. But within its walls, hundreds of nobles were questioned, persuaded, and purified. The rack stretched more than traitors. It stretched loyalty itself. The interrogators were not common brutes, but educated men of the court, fluent in scripture and politics alike. They could make a man confess his treason, even if he had none to confess. The Tower's most infamous prisoner was Anne Boleyn, queen to Henry VIII. Though she was never tortured physically, her spirit was broken by the slow and deliberate cruelty of isolation, fear, and betrayal. Her interrogations were conducted not with devices of iron, but with words designed to crush the soul. In the eyes of power, there were many kinds of racks.
Elsewhere, in France, the dungeons beneath the Château d'Amboise and the Bastille were reserved for the noble and the dangerous, poets who mocked the king, philosophers who questioned God, and courtiers who whispered too boldly in the queen's ear. They were not executed immediately. That would have been merciful. Instead, they were kept alive in damp stone cells, forgotten by the sun, their names erased from records, but remembered in rumor. The Spanish crown had its own secrets. Beneath royal chapels and monasteries, inquisitorial chambers waited for those whose devotion was doubted. To defy the king was to defy God,
and that sin was punishable by both. It was not only men who suffered. Queens, mistresses, and noblewomen often became pawns in the cruel games of dynasty and desire. Lucrezia Borgia, often accused of poison and manipulation, lived surrounded by the whispers of torture, tools not meant for her, but for those who defied her family's will. Beneath the glittering courts of Italy, dungeons filled with the cries of servants and lovers who knew too much. In Florence, the Medici family's secret prisons were designed like tombs, narrow, airless chambers beneath palazzos, where those who opposed the family's rule vanished without trial. Many were buried alive in silence, their bones discovered centuries later when the buildings above crumbled with time. But not all torture was physical. For the nobility, humiliation was a weapon far more cutting than the sword. Imprisonment without explanation, forced confessions of imagined crimes, public disgrace disguised as justice. The dungeon was not always beneath the palace. Sometimes it was inside the mind. To the rulers, these punishments were necessary. Treason, heresy, betrayal, they were diseases that could not be allowed to spread. The dungeon was the cure. Better one noble's agony, one royal decree read, than a kingdom's ruin. Yet the truth was darker. The royal dungeon was not just a place of justice, it was a mirror of fear. Kings feared their counselors, queens feared their courts, princes feared their brothers. Every chain that clanked below reminded the palace above that power was fragile and that loyalty could shatter like glass. It is said that King Edward II of England met his end in such a chamber, deposed, imprisoned, and executed in secret. The chronicles whisper that a red-hot poker was thrust into his body, leaving no visible wound, so that his murder would appear as divine punishment rather than human treachery. Whether truth or legend, the tale reflects a grim pattern. Even royalty was not safe from its own devices. The dungeons beneath Versailles, Madrid, Vienna, each bore the same stench of hypocrisy. Monarchs who preached civility in daylight sanctioned agony by candlelight. In these dark chambers, truth was whatever the crown needed it to be. Yet those who survived sometimes lived to speak of it. Their testimonies, written in trembling hands, tell of guards who looked away, confessors who cried as they listened, and executioners who whispered apologies before tightening the chains. In the dim world of royal justice, even monsters wept.
When the Enlightenment dawned, kings and queens began to hide their cruelty behind laws and polite language. The torture chambers were sealed, their entrances bricked over. But the silence that followed was not peace, it was shame. The palaces above continued to shine, their ballrooms glittering like never before, while the dungeons below filled with ghosts that no light could reach. Today, tourists walk through those halls, admiring portraits of noble faces, unaware of the cries that once echoed beneath their feet. Guides speak of architecture, of heritage, of legacy, but few mention what the stones remember. The royal dungeon was never just a place, it was an idea, that power could cleanse itself through cruelty, that fear could secure the throne. But history has a way of turning on its masters. The same ropes that bound peasants would one day bind kings. The same walls that swallowed traitors would later confine monarchs. For beneath every crown there is a chain, and beneath every kingdom a dungeon still waits, patient, silent, eternal. They came at dawn, always at dawn, when mist still clung to the fields, when the world was caught between darkness and light.
The knock on the door was soft, almost polite. "In the name of God," they said, "you are summoned to answer for your deeds." But everyone knew what that meant. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe's witch hunts spread like wildfire through fear and faith intertwined. Villages that had known peace for generations turned against their own. A woman who healed the sick, a widow who lived alone, a midwife whose herbs worked too well, all could be branded a servant of the devil. And when suspicion was not enough, pain would prove what reason could not. The instruments of this madness were many, but their purpose was one: to extract confessions that confirmed the fears of the accusers. Torture did not seek truth. It sought agreement, and few could resist its language. The thumbscrew was among the simplest and most common tools. 2 iron bars, a screw, and the fragile bones of human hands caught between them. The device crushed slowly, deliberately. Fingernails split, joints burst, nerves screamed. With every turn, the accused was asked to name her accomplices. Who else danced with her in the night? Who else whispered to demons? Names were given, always, because in that moment, silence was a sin too great to bear. Then came the witch's bridle, an iron cage fitted over the head, its bit forced into the mouth. It pierced the tongue, silencing even prayer. Some versions had bells, so that every movement announced the condemned's shame to the village. Worn for hours or days, it reduced speech to sobs. A fitting punishment, they said, for women whose words bewitched men.
For those accused of using water in their rituals, there was the dunking chair, or trial by water. The logic was divine, but cruel. If water rejected the witch, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent. Women were bound and lowered into rivers or ponds. Some drowned before they could be declared pure. Those who survived were returned to the dungeon for questioning. The witch's chair, made of iron, its surface studded with spikes, awaited many of them. The victim was stripped and forced to sit upon it, hands and feet bound. Sometimes it was heated from below, glowing red beneath trembling flesh. The spikes were not meant to kill, but to wound, to remind the body that pain could always go deeper. In Germany, the boot became infamous. Wooden or iron cases were fitted around the legs, and wedges were hammered between the boards until bones shattered and blood ran freely. In Scotland, the device was so feared that prisoners confessed before it even touched them. Each region had its own favorite method, each tribunal its own holy procedure. And behind every act of torture stood the same question: do you renounce Satan? But Satan was a convenient phantom. The real enemy was the woman who would not obey, who healed without permission, who spoke too freely, who refused to bow. The witch trials were less about faith than control. Torture was not the path to truth. It was the mechanism of silence. Records from witch hunts across Europe, Germany, Scotland, France, Switzerland, tell the same story. Women accused under impossible logic, that their suffering was proof of guilt, that their endurance was proof of the devil's protection. When they fainted, they were revived with cold water. When they wept, it was taken as deceit. The interrogators demanded confession until words lost all meaning. One account from Würzburg reads, "The accused did not confess after 2 turns of the screws. At the 3rd, she cried that she had danced with the evil one upon the mountain. She was burned 2 days later, her ashes scattered for the peace of the realm." Even after confession, torture continued.
To confirm the truth, they said. The body was made to repeat what the tongue had already surrendered. By the end, confession and agony were one. And when the flames rose in the town square, people gathered. The pyre crackled beneath the winter sky. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Priests recited prayers. The condemned was given a chance to repent. Few could speak through the pain. Those who did often said the same words, "I forgive you." Fire was believed to purify, the ashes to erase sin. But what burned in those fires was not evil. It was the evidence of a society's fear. By the time the witch trials ended, tens of thousands had perished. Entire villages of women were erased from history. Midwives, healers, widows, all condemned by superstition, wrapped in scripture.
The instruments of torture were later displayed as curiosities in courts and museums, their horror reduced to spectacle. But each device still carries the echo of its true purpose, to destroy the sacred act of female voice. For the witch hunts were never just about heresy. They were about power, about fear of knowledge, about men who saw danger in the autonomy of women. And though the flames of the pyre have long gone out, their smoke still lingers in the air of history. The smell of fear turned righteous, of cruelty sanctified by faith. When we read the confessions now, the trembling handwriting, the words dictated under agony, we see not guilt, but tragedy. We hear voices that never stopped speaking, only learned too late that the world did not want to listen. They called it justice, they called it God's will, but it was neither. It was simply the sound of humanity, once again mistaking its own fear for truth. They called them healers, men of reason, servants of progress. But in the shadow of the Middle Ages and long after, there existed another breed of physician, one who sought understanding not through compassion, but through pain. In their hands, the human body became an experiment. The dungeon and the operating table were not so different. When plague and pestilence swept through Europe, medicine was still ruled by superstition and blood. Diseases were seen as divine punishment, cures as acts of faith. And yet among the physicians and scholars who gathered in the candlelit halls of early universities, a new idea was forming, that knowledge could come from dissection, from observation, from the opening of flesh. But where, they asked, could they find the bodies? Thus began the dark marriage of torture and medicine, a union that would shape centuries of cruelty disguised as discovery. In the hospitals of Florence, Bologna, and Paris, condemned prisoners became subjects of study. Their punishment was not only death, but education. Before the executioner's blade fell, the physicians watched. They noted the movements of muscles, the final spasms of breath. Afterward, they cut, peeled, measured. Each incision, they believed, brought mankind closer to truth. They did not see it as desecration. They saw it as duty. In secret chambers of anatomy schools, corpses hung like relics, dissected by candlelight. Students in black robes stood in silence as the master lectured. Here is the heart of a thief. Note how fear contracts its chambers. They wrote, they sketched, they learned, and they forgot that the heart they studied had once loved, had once pleaded.
The most infamous of these experiments took place during the rise of the Inquisition and beyond.
Torture chambers provided a steady supply of bodies. The heretic, the criminal, the witch, the unwanted. The dead were no longer buried. They were opened. But not all waited for death. Records from 16th century France and Italy describe vivisections, surgeries performed on the living, justified as acts of research. The victims were promised mercy, forgiveness, or swift death afterward. Instead, they were strapped to tables while knives traced the path of their own pulse. In one chilling account from Bologna, a condemned man was opened alive so that scholars might observe the beating heart. He screamed only once and then became quiet, as if curious himself. This was not sadism, not in their minds. It was curiosity unrestrained. Pain was no longer sin, it was data. Physicians began to collaborate with executioners, studying how bodies reacted to hanging, to boiling, to the wheel. The distance between healer and torturer grew dangerously thin. The executioner teaches death, one surgeon wrote, and we, by it, teach life. And so, the torture chamber became the laboratory. They studied pain itself, its thresholds, its patterns, its silence. Some inquisitors kept records of how long it took before the body fainted, how certain devices caused madness before death. Physicians read these reports eagerly, using them to refine surgical practice. What they learned in the dungeon, they applied in the hospital. Anatomy advanced, but at what cost? Through this dark exchange, modern medicine began to take shape. The detailed sketches of Vesalius, the anatomical drawings of Leonardo da Vinci, and the treatises of Père were built upon a mountain of unrecorded suffering. Though these men sought enlightenment, they lived in a world where knowledge was soaked in blood. There were even those who believed pain itself could heal. In monasteries and early hospitals, patients were bled, burned, or starved to drive out evil humors. Physicians called it balancing the body. The more pain a patient endured, the more cleansing it was believed to be. The plague doctors of the 14th century, masked in their long-beaked visors, performed crude surgeries on the dying, often without anesthesia. They cut into boils, drained black blood, and watched life slip away with detached fascination. Their goal was noble. Their methods were not. Later, during the Renaissance, the obsession deepened. The body became a map to be conquered. Physicians competed to uncover new truths about how much pain the human form could survive. They tested fire, freezing, suffocation, poison, each experiment cloaked in the name of learning.
But the strangest transformation was moral. The same societies that condemned witches and heretics now celebrated surgeons who performed horrors in the name of science. What had once been torture became procedure. What had once been punishment became progress. And so the line between torment and treatment vanished. One could be strapped to a table screaming, and it was called salvation, not damnation. The doctors of suffering did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as pioneers. The human body, one physician wrote, must be open to reveal the divine mechanism within. He believed that pain was the key to understanding life, and perhaps, in a way, he was right. For pain reveals what the body hides and what the soul cannot bear to say. Yet, the echoes of those experiments linger still. From the medieval dungeon to the modern laboratory, the question remains, when does the pursuit of knowledge become a justification for cruelty? The tools have changed. The needle's finer, the room's cleaner, the method's quieter. But the spirit of the old physician still haunts us. The desire to see how far we can go before compassion becomes inconvenience. The doctors of suffering may be gone, but their lesson remains, that progress, if stripped of empathy, can look very much like torture in a brighter light. And when we marvel at the brilliance of modern medicine, we would do well to remember its shadowed birth, the sound of scalpels over screams, the flicker of torches on pale skin, and the silence that followed each experiment, recorded only as successful. By the late 17th century, Europe began to see itself as enlightened. The church's grip loosened. Monarchs spoke of reason, philosophy, and human dignity. The dungeons were sealed, the racks dismantled, the fires of the stake quenched. The age of torture, they said, was over. But truth, like pain, rarely dies. It only changes shape. The public executions that once drew crowds to the town square grew quieter. No longer did men cheer as bodies broke upon the wheel. No longer did priests bless the flames that licked at heretics. Civilization demanded refinement, and refinement required hypocrisy. The Enlightenment thinkers from Voltaire to Beccaria condemned torture as barbaric and irrational. It is better that 10 guilty men go free than one innocent man suffer, Beccaria wrote. Philosophers argued that truth extracted through pain was no truth at all, that cruelty degraded the very societies it sought to protect. And yet, even as these words spread through Europe's salons and academies, the prisons filled with new devices, quieter, cleaner, and far more efficient. The age of the spectacle gave way to the age of control. Torture did not vanish, it simply learned to whisper.
In France, the guillotine was praised as humane, a mechanical salvation that killed without suffering. Its blade was swift, impartial, merciful. But beneath its philosophy lay the same hunger for order. The crowd still gathered. The heads still fell. The difference was that now death was considered rational. Elsewhere, punishment became psychological. Solitary confinement replaced the rack. Starvation replaced the wheel. The dungeon became the prison cell. The torturer became the warden. The goal was no longer confession, but correction, to reshape the soul instead of the flesh. Michel Foucault, centuries later, would call it the birth of the prison, but in truth, it was the evolution of the dungeon. In the new world of reason, pain was hidden behind walls of legality. Courts no longer ordered torture, they sanctioned interrogation. The same methods remained, dressed in new language: coercion, persuasion, re-education. The inquisitor's tools were gone, but his logic survived. That fear could reveal truth, that suffering could ensure obedience. The Enlightenment brought light, but not mercy. For even as kings and philosophers spoke of human rights, Europe's colonies became laboratories of cruelty. Across oceans, in Africa, the Americas, and Asia, the same empires that banned torture at home practiced it abroad, on slaves, on rebels, on anyone who stood in the path of profit. The instruments were different, the justifications the same. Civilization, they said, required discipline. Progress demanded control. The whip was simply another kind of sermon. And when the industrial age dawned, torture found new allies in technology. Iron gave way to steel. Restraints became mechanical, precise. Pain could now be delivered not by a man's hand, but by a system. Factories of punishment arose. Prisons, workhouses, asylums, where order was enforced not through fire, but through exhaustion. It was the perfect illusion, cruelty without blood. To the public, society was advancing. No more screams echoed through the streets, no more pyres burned at dawn. But within these new institutions, the old sounds persisted. Muffled sobs, the rattle of chains, the quiet despair of those who were forgotten. Even religion adapted. The Church, shamed by its history, traded the whip for guilt. Suffering became internalized, a penance of the soul. Sin was no longer purged by iron, by silence and shame. The dungeon had moved inward.
And still, the philosophers celebrated progress. They could not see that humanity had merely refined its cruelty. The visible horror of the rack had been replaced by invisible suffering, starvation, isolation, mental collapse. The pain that once screamed in public now whispered behind locked doors. By the 19th century, torture was officially outlawed across much of Europe. The nations congratulated themselves. But beneath their laws, wars raged, rebellions rose, and governments discovered new reasons to resurrect the old ways. In the trenches of colonial outposts, in interrogation rooms of secret police, in the frozen camps of the 20th century, the interrogator's art returned, now clothed in the rhetoric of security, ideology, and national duty. The questions were the same. Who are your allies? What do you believe? Confess. The medieval dungeon was gone. The modern state had taken its place. And so, the history of torture became a mirror of progress itself. Every step forward shadowed by the same instinct to dominate, to force, to break. Humanity learned to invent new machines of cruelty even as it declared itself civilized. But perhaps the greatest transformation was philosophical. The torturer no longer needed spikes or flames. He needed words. Interrogation manuals replaced the rack. Propaganda replaced the whip. Fear became psychological. Pain became invisible. Nations learned that to control the mind was far more efficient than breaking the body. And so, even in peace, the dungeon endured. In the secrecy of prisons, in the silence of censorship, in the quiet compliance of those too afraid to speak. The age of torture did not end, it merely went underground. Every law that banned it gave it a new disguise. Every civilization that condemned it found another name. From the holy chambers of the Inquisition to the sterile rooms of modern power, the message remained unchanged. Obedience is peace, and truth belongs to the strong. Centuries after the last rack was burned, the same question lingers in the human heart. Are we truly free from the need to inflict pain? Or have we only learned to make it invisible? Perhaps that is the final illusion, that cruelty was ever a relic of the past, that we, in all our reason and progress, have outgrown the darkness.
But listen closely. Beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, beneath the polite words of law and order, there is still a sound, faint, rhythmic, familiar. The creak of a wheel turning, the whisper of a question asked one time too many, the ghost of a scream swallowed by silence. Torture did not die with the Middle Ages, it adapted, as we did. And in that evolution, the dungeon found its perfect disguise, civilization itself. The doors open with a soft creak, and cool air spills out, carrying with it the faint scent of rust, dust, and something older. You step inside, and the light dims. There, behind glass and shadow, they wait. Iron Maidens, racks, Wheels, chains, masks, spikes polished to a dull sheen. Welcome to the museums of pain, the sanctuaries of humanity's darkest genius. Here, torture has become history. In Prague, in Nuremberg, in London, in countless quiet towns across Europe, these museums stand where dungeons once lived. The walls are clean now, the floors swept, the air silent except for the murmurs of visitors and the clicking of shoes. The screams that once filled these places have been replaced by guided tours and audio narrations in soft voices. But the air feels heavy, as though every object still remembers what it was made to do. The curator gestures proudly to the iron chair, its spikes glinting beneath museum light. A sign explains its use, its victims, its century. People lean closer, fascinated, horrified. They take photos. A few make nervous jokes to fill the silence. No one notices how close they stand to the ghosts. Further down the hall, the rack stretches beneath a spotlight. Its ropes are frayed, its wood splintered with age. It looks almost harmless now, like a stage prop. A small plaque reads, "Instrument of Interrogation, 15th Century." The description is clinical, bloodless. It does not mention how joints popped, or how screams once echoed so violently the walls seemed to breathe. The Iron Maiden stands nearby, the myth made metal, her face expressionless and eternal. Children stare up at her, unsure whether to fear or admire her. Their parents whisper the legend of the spikes inside, of slow deaths and confessions. The guide reminds them that it may have been a 19th century fabrication, but the story always wins. Myths are stronger than facts when the subject is cruelty.
Every museum of torture walks the same fine line between remembrance and spectacle, between horror and fascination. Some displays are reverent, a warning, a lesson. Others feel almost theatrical, designed to entertain as much as to educate. Tourists laugh nervously as they pose beside the wheel, as if to prove they are not afraid. But the truth is, they are. Not of the devices, but of what they reveal about us. For these museums do not exist to show monsters. They exist to show humanity, to remind us that it was people, not beasts, who built these machines. Craftsmen forged them, judges approved them, priests blessed them. The hands that made the rack also carved altarpieces. The minds that designed the chair also painted cathedrals. And yet, here in these quiet halls, history feels sanitized. Pain has been curated. The terror of the dungeon has been reduced to information, a paragraph, a ticket price, a souvenir. We study cruelty as if it were an artifact, not a mirror. In a small museum in Rottenburg, Germany, a display of executioners' masks draws curious stares. Each mask is grotesque, carved to shame the wearer, the liar's long tongue, the gossip's donkey ears, the adulterer's horns. Behind glass, they are symbols of a barbaric past, but centuries ago, they were instruments of humiliation, worn through tears and screams in front of jeering crowds. The museum sign reads, "Moral education through fear." And perhaps nothing has changed, for fear still educates. It just wears a subtler mask now. The torture chamber became the classroom of history. The prison became the exhibit, the audience, the students. We look, we learn, and we tell ourselves we would never have done the same. But the fascination betrays us. We cannot look away. Visitors spend longer at the torture exhibits than anywhere else. They linger over the iron, the fire, the cruelty, not because they celebrate it, but because, in some deep and ancient way, they recognize it.
Pain speaks a language older than empathy. It whispers of power, of control, of mortality, things we all understand. The museums of pain capitalize on that truth. They sell postcards, replicas, and keychains shaped like tiny Iron Maidens. Outside, gift shops glow with cheerful lights. You can buy horror bottled in souvenir form. Take cruelty home as memory. It is the most human irony of all. We turn suffering into memento. And yet, within this contradiction lies something valuable, a warning preserved in glass. For though the displays are static, the lessons are not. The tools may be ancient, but the urge they represent is alive and thriving.
Every rack reminds us of the prisons still hidden. Every mask echoes the modern tools of shame. Every Iron Maiden mirrors the ways we still crush one another, not with spikes, but with words, systems, silence. The museums pretend to show what has ended. In truth, they show what continues. A visitor walks alone through a corridor lined with manacles and branding irons. The lights flicker slightly. The air feels colder. For a brief moment, time folds, and they imagine hearing something faint, a whisper in the air, a prayer, a sob, a question that was never answered. Then it's gone, replaced by the hum of modern electricity. The guide thanks the group for coming. Outside, sunlight pours over cobblestones. Life resumes. The horror is contained again, behind doors, behind glass, behind memory. But as the last visitor glances back at the museum's facade, they realize something. The building does not just preserve the past, it feeds on the future. Every new war, every new atrocity ensures its relevance. Humanity keeps supplying the exhibit. The museums of pain do not ask us to look, they ask us to understand. And when we leave, walking into the brightness, we carry a truth that cannot be sealed behind glass, that the past we pity is not gone. It breathes within us still, disguised as civilization, waiting for the next generation to rediscover what it means to call suffering justice. The walls of those museums whisper a single warning to all who listen closely enough. History does not repeat, it remembers. There is a silence that lingers after centuries of screaming, a silence so heavy that even time seems afraid to disturb it. The chains are rusted, the torches long extinguished, but the walls still remember. Every device, every scream, every prayer that rose and died in those chambers has left an echo in the human heart. This is where our journey ends, not in the dungeon, but in the reflection it leaves behind. The history of torture is not a story about the past. It is a mirror, dark, cracked, and terribly honest. It shows us what we become when fear wears the mask of justice, when power calls itself purity, when pain is mistaken for truth. Look closely, and you will see more than iron and rope. You will see yourself. Centuries ago, a man was stretched on the rack for refusing to confess a lie. A woman was burned for healing with herbs. A prisoner whispered names he had never heard before, just to make the agony stop. And above them, the men who ordered it all believed they were serving something greater: God, king, country, law.
But behind every justification lay the same hunger: control.
The rack, the wheel, the iron chair. They were never truly about truth. They were about the idea of truth, sculpted to fit the desires of those in power. Torture made certainty easy. A scream could be called proof. A confession could be declared divine. Pain simplified everything. Even now, that same logic survives, only dressed in different words. We call it security. We call it discipline. We call it order. And when we look at history's horrors, we comfort ourselves with the lie that we are different. But the iron mirror does not lie. In it, we still see the same patterns. We see men and women punished for beliefs, silenced for speech, exiled for difference. We see the ghosts of inquisitors in uniforms and judges' robes. We see the same instinct to break what we fear, to wound what we do not understand. Perhaps the most terrifying truth is this: humanity never loved pain itself. It loved control through pain. Torture was not born of cruelty alone, but of structure, of law, ritual, faith. It was systematic, predictable, rational. That is what makes it eternal. Every era invents its own devices. Iron and rope become isolation and shame. Fire becomes propaganda. The wheel becomes a question repeated until the answer no longer matters. The wheel becomes the endless spin of history itself, turning, grinding, forgetting nothing. Yet there is another reflection, faint, fragile, but still visible. Alongside the cruelty runs a second current, resistance. For every torturer who believed in the sanctity of pain, there was someone who refused to confess, who chose death over deceit, who whispered a final prayer into the dark. Their courage, unrecorded, is the quiet counterweight to centuries of horror. The iron mirror shows that too, the resilience of the human spirit, bent but unbroken. Think of the woman who endured the pair of anguish and forgave her accusers. Think of the man who died on the wheel with a hymn still on his lips. Think of the countless nameless souls who, even as their bodies shattered, clung to something that pain could not reach: dignity. That is what history forgets, but the walls remember. In every museum of torture, in every surviving dungeon, there is a stillness that feels almost holy. It is not the holiness of the church that built these chambers, but of those who suffered within them. A holiness born of endurance, of innocence, of final silence. We walk through these places now as spectators, safe in the illusion that we are civilized. But civilization has always been a thin veil stretched over the same darkness. Behind every courtroom, every prison, every government office that speaks of truth and justice, the shadow of the dungeon still stirs. The tools have changed, but the instinct remains. And so the iron mirror stares back at us, asking questions we rarely want to answer. What are we willing to do in the name of truth? How much pain will we allow if we believe it serves the greater good? And when we look upon the tortured, do we see victims or merely reflections of our own fears? Perhaps the lesson of the medieval world is not how far we have come, but how easily we could return. For the line between righteousness and cruelty has always been written in trembling hands, and history shows how quickly ink turns to blood. The mirror's surface darkens as we look deeper. Within it we see the rack, the wheel, the iron chair, not as relics, but as warnings. We see torches flicker like the screens of our age, each one reflecting faces that watch suffering from a safe distance. We see the same fascination, the same quiet thrill that once filled the crowds at public executions. It is not enough to say we would never do the same. The truth is more uncomfortable. We still do, only differently. When we ignore the suffering of others, when we silence those who speak against injustice, when we let cruelty thrive in secrecy, we turn the handle of the rack once more. But there is hope, even here, in the darkest reflection. For the same hands that forged instruments of torment also built cathedrals. The same hearts that burned with cruelty also burned with faith, compassion, love. Humanity is not one or the other, it is both, forever bound by its own contradictions. The dungeon is part of us, but so is the light that rises above it. The story of torture is the story of mankind learning, slowly, painfully, that power without empathy is ruin. It is the story of our worst selves teaching our better ones what never to become again. And perhaps that is the purpose of remembering, not to marvel at horror, but to understand it. Because history is not only what we inherit, it is what we repeat. And if we are to end the cycle, truly end it, we must first dare to see ourselves clearly, unflinchingly, in the iron that humanity forged for its own undoing. Only then will the dungeon finally grow quiet. Only then will the iron mirror go dark.